Hello, hi. Uh, it says unable to connect to chat, so three of you that are actually watching this, two of you. Zero. Oh, did I lose my internet again? I might have lost my internet connection. Just going to detect that. Yeah, the chat isn't working for me, so I can't actually tell if this is live or if anyone can see it. No, it seems to be okay. I think it's just that the chat function isn't working. It sucks. That's the best thing about this whole thing. Okay. What if I were to, I don't know, pop out chat? Oh, I can see you now. Okay, it popped out. I'm going to pop it back in. I know it's funny. That's why I said it. Oh no, I don't know how to pop it back in. Just drag and drop. Oh, yeah, what if I close that? No. Okay, well, I will just use the pop-out chat. Drag it over to the side. So I can see his, but I can also see myself and how my hair did not turn out today. I was trying to kind of braid it over the top, but the braids ran out at the top. That's okay. I said I wouldn't start for another 5 or 10 minutes. I'll just talk about some stories that I do want to tell. 10 minutes. When did I post it? 7 minutes ago. Okay, good. I know there are probably not more people coming than who's here, but I just want to be fair. Yeah. Okay. Today I got another story by Edgar Allan Poe, which I think is an abridged version. I'm not sure. It's quite short, so I think if I'm still kind of feeling it after that, I'll read another very short Bradbury. You remember the Bradbury episode? It was that fantastic one with what the fuck is this? The one with the amazing hetero relationship that we should all strive for. Don't think any cats coming in today. Yes. So this comes from a book that was in my great grandmother's house when I was growing up, when I was little. And it was there when my dad was little too. And we both had the absolute shit scared out of us by it. Like 3 or 4 different stories in here. They're fantastic. There's one that I really like, but it's written, as they do it completely in like Scots dialect, which I could do really badly, but I'm not sure that the scary bit of it would actually come across. So, we got 3 people here. That is good enough for me. Unless, let me just check. Refresh the page. Okay. If I refresh the page, will that take away this live stream? I think it might. I could try it. I can do a Scottish accent. I can't do an accent that a person from Scotland might actually have. I can do like a comedy sketch show Scottish accent. Real bad one. Okay. All right. We're gonna get started on. Actually, no. First, I'm just gonna say a little bit about Edgar Allan Poe because you guys probably know, but I don't know who's gonna be watching this in the future of posterity. Sorry, we burned the planet. But so many interesting things about Poe, including the fact that he, for a while, was living with his auntie and her 9-year-old daughter, Virginia, his first cousin, who he called Sissy. And Virginia used to run around delivering love letters to and from Edgar Allan Poe, her older first cousin, and this woman. So that didn't work out anyway. And when Virginia was 13, she and Eddie and Sissy, lest we forget, he called her Sissy, they got married. They lied and said that her age was 21. I've never seen a 13-year-old who looks like a 21-year-old, but okay. And yeah, apparently they were very happy together. They were kind of obsessed with each other. And the only picture we have of Virginia Clem is one that was painted right after she died. I was like, oh shit. Like, she actually died and I don't have a camera. We got to get a guy in, which people used to do. So that's fine. Yeah, so almost every Poe story seems to have this beautiful woman in it who dies. And I just wonder what Virginia thought about that when she was living with the tuberculosis that did eventually kill her. Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's super romantic. Thanks, Danny. They were happy, apparently. The olden days were a trip. I mean, you hit on your 13-year-old cousin nowadays. I don't know. I have not done that. Oh no, wait. No. This was me when I was 13. Anyway, not got into it. It's a funny story, but it's for another time. So, Edgar Allan Poe's Berenice, which I think there are a couple different ways of pronouncing it, but I'm just going to go this way. Berenice and I were cousins, and we grew up together in my paternal halls. Yet differently we grew. I ill of health and buried in gloom. She agile, graceful, and overflowing with energy. Hers the ramble on the hillside, mine the studies of the cloister. I living within my own heart, an addicted body and soul to the most intense and painful meditation. She roaming carelessly through life with no thought of the shadows in her path or the silent flight of the raven-winged hours. Berenice, I call upon her name, Berenice, and from the grey ruins of memory 1,000 tumultuous recollections are startled at the sound. Ah, vividly is her image before me now, as in the early days of her light-heartedness and joy. Oh, gorgeous yet fantastic beauty! Oh, sylph amid the shrubberies of Arnheim! This is before shrubbery was a funny word. Oh, naiad among its fountains! And then all is mystery and terror in a tale which should not be told. Disease, a fatal disease, fell like the simoom upon her frame, and even while I gazed upon her, the spirit of change swept over her, pervading her mind, her habits, and her character, and, in a manner the most subtle and terrible, disturbing even the identity of her person. Alas, the destroyer came and went, and the victim, where was she? I knew her not, or knew her no longer as Berenice. Among the numerous train of maladies superinduced by that fatal and primary one which effected a revolution of so horrible a kind in the moral and physical well-being of my cousin, may be mentioned as the most distressing and obstinate in its nature a species of epilepsy, not unfrequently terminating in trance itself, trance very nearly resembling positive dissolution, and from which her manner of recovery was, in most instances, startlingly abrupt. In the meantime, my own disease, for I have been told that I should call it by no other appellation, my own disease then grew rapidly upon me, and assumed finally a monomaniac character of a novel and extraordinary form, hourly and momently gaining vigour, and at length obtaining over me the most incomprehensible ascendancy. This monomania, if I must so term it, consisted in a morbid irritability of those properties of the mind in metaphysical science termed the attentive. It is more than probable that I am not understood, but I fear indeed that it is in no manner possible to convey to the mind of the merely general reader any adequate idea of that nervous intensity of interest with which, in my case, the powers of meditation, not to speak technically, busied and buried themselves in the contemplation of even the most ordinary objects of the universe. To muse for long, unwearied hours with my attention riveted to some frivolous device in the margin or in the typography of a book, to become absorbed for the better part of a summer's day in a quaint shadow falling aslant upon the tapestry or upon the door, to lose myself for an entire night in watching the steady flame of a lamp or the embers of a fire, to dream away whole days over the perfume of a flower, to repeat monotonously some common word until the sound, by dint of frequent repetition, ceased to convey any idea whatever to the mind, to lose all sense of motion or physical existence by means of absolute bodily quiescence, long and obstinately persevered in. Such were a few of the most common and least pernicious vagaries induced by a condition of the mental faculties. Not indeed altogether unparalleled, but certainly bidding defiance to anything like analysis or explanation. I think he's talking about kind of like, is it an ADD thing? Is it a, doesn't matter. We're not going to diagnose the narrator right now. Yet let me not be misapprehended. The undue, earnest, and morbid attention thus excited by objects in their own nature frivolous must not be confounded in character with that ruminating propensity common to all mankind, and more especially indulged in by persons of ardent imagination. It was not even, as might first be supposed, an extreme condition or exaggeration of such propensity, but primarily and essentially distinct and different. In the one instance, the dreamer or enthusiast, being interested by an object usually not frivolous, imperceptibly loses sight of this object in a wilderness of deductions and suggestions issuing therefrom, until at the conclusion of a daydream, often replete with luxury, he finds the incitamentum, or first cause of his musings, entirely vanished and forgotten. In my case, the primary object was invariably frivolous, although assuming, through the medium of my distempered vision, a refracted and unreal importance. Few deductions, if any, were made, and those few pertinaciously returning in upon the original object as a centre. The meditations were never pleasurable, and at the termination of the reverie, the first cause, so far from being out of sight, had attained that supernaturally exaggerated interest which was the prevailing feature of the disease. In a word, the powers of mind more particularly exercised were, with me, as I have said before, the attentive, and are, with the daydreamer, the speculative. My books at this epoch, if they did not actually serve to irritate the disorder, partook, it will be perceived, largely, in their imaginative and inconsequential nature, of the characteristic qualities of the disorder itself. I well remember, among others, the treatise of the noble Italian Celia secundus curio, de amplitudine beate regni Dei. St. Austin's great work. St. Augustine's been referred to as St. Austin. Back in the day, St. Austin's great work, The City of God, and Tertullian, De Carne Christi, in which the paradoxical sentence, mortuus est Dei filius, credibile est quia ineptum est, et sepultus resurrexit, certum est quia impossibile est. It is, the Son of God is dead. No, sorry. Thank you. It's not perfect. It's far from perfect, but thank you. And my translation is not good. It's believable that it is inept and rises from the tomb, which certainly is impossible. No, I'm going to have to look that up. I'm going to have to look the quote up and get back to you guys. Hello, Blevelyn. We're reading Berenice. I don't know when you joined. Anyway, basically, the narrator is talking about how he has a very special mind. I'm kind of picturing Sheldon a little bit. Thank you, John. If you need an exorcism, send that Latin my way. The exorcism is, I think, the only mental health treatment that I haven't tried yet. Sorry. Okay. Blah, blah. Thus it will appear that, shaken from its balance only by trivial things, my reason bore resemblance to that ocean crag spoken of by Ptolemy Hephaestion, which, steadily resisting the attacks of human violence and the fiercer fury of the waters and the winds, trembled only to the touch of the flower called asphodel. And although to a careless thinker it might appear a matter beyond doubt that the alteration produced by her unhappy malady in the moral condition of Berenice would afford me many objects for the exercise of that intense and abnormal meditation whose nature I've been at some trouble in explaining, yet such was not in any degree the case. In the lucid intervals of my infirmity, her calamity indeed gave me pain, and taking deeply to heart that total wreck of her fair and gentle life, I did not fail to ponder frequently and bitterly upon the wonder-working means by which so strange a revolution had been so suddenly brought to pass. But these reflections partook not of the idiosyncrasy of my disease, and were such as would have occurred, under similar circumstances, to the ordinary mass of mankind. True to its own character, my disorder revelled in the less important but more startling changes wrought in the physical frame of Berenice, in the singular and most appalling distortion of her personal identity. During the brightest days of her unparalleled beauty, most surely I had never loved her. In the strange anomaly of my existence, feelings with me had never been of the heart, and my passions always were of the mind. Through the grey of the early morning, among the trellised shadows of the forest at noonday, and in the silence of my library at night, she had flitted by my eyes, and I had seen her, not as the living and breathing Berenice, but as the Berenice of a dream, not as a being of the earth, earthy, but as an abstraction of such a being, not as a thing to admire, but to analyze, not as an object of love, but as the theme of the most abstruse, though desultory speculation. And now I shuddered in her presence, and grew pale at her approach. Yet bitterly lamenting her fallen and desolate condition, I called to mind that she had loved me long, and in an evil moment I spoke to her of marriage. Girls really love getting married because you feel sorry for them. Everyone loves it. And at length the period of our nuptials was approaching, when, upon an afternoon in the winter of the year, one of those unseasonably warm, calm, and misty days which are the nurse of the beautiful halcyon, I sat, as I thought, alone, in the inner apartment of the library. But uplifting my eyes, I saw that Berenice stood before me. Was it my own excited imagination, or the misty influence of the atmosphere, or the uncertain twilight of the chamber, or the grey draperies which fell around her figure, that caused in it so vacillating and indistinct an outline? I could not tell. She spoke no word, and not for worlds could I have uttered a syllable. An icy chill ran through my frame. A sense of insufferable anxiety oppressed me. A consuming curiosity pervaded my soul, and sinking back upon the chair, I remained for some time breathless and motionless, with my eyes riveted upon her person. Alas, its emaciation was excessive, and not one vestige of the former being lurked in any single line of the contour. My burning glances at length fell upon the face. The forehead was high, and very pale, and singularly placid, and the once jetty hair fell partially over it, and overshadowed the hollow temples with innumerable ringlets now of a vivid yellow, and jarring discordantly in their fantastic character with the reigning melancholy of the countenance. The eyes were lifeless and lustreless, and seemingly pupilless, and I shrank involuntarily from their glassy stare to the contemplation of the thin and shrunken lips. They parted, and in a smile of peculiar meaning, the teeth of the changed Berenice disclosed themselves slowly to my view. Would to God that I had never beheld them, or that having done so, I had died. The shutting of a door disturbed me, and looking up, I found that my cousin had departed from the chamber, but from the disordered chamber of my brain had not, alas, departed, and would not be driven away, the white and ghastly spectrum of the teeth. Not a speck on their surface, not a shade on their enamel, not an indenture in their edges, but what that period of her smile had sufficed to brand in on my memory. I saw them now even more unequivocally than I beheld them then. Here's dramatic, yeah. The teeth, they were here and there and everywhere, and visibly and palpably before me, long, narrow, and excessively white, with the pale lips writhing about them, as in the very moment of their first terrible development. Then came the full fury of my monomania, and I struggled in vain against its strange and irresistible influence. In the multiplied objects of the external world, I had no thoughts but for the teeth. For these I longed with a frenzied desire. All other matters and all different interests became absorbed in their single contemplation. They alone were present to the mental eye, and they, in their sole individuality, became the essence of my mental life. I held them in every light. I turned them in every attitude. I surveyed their characteristics. I dwelt upon their peculiarities. I pondered upon their conformation. I mused upon the alteration in their nature. I shuddered as I assigned to them in imagination a sensitive and sentient power, and even when unassisted by the lips, a capability of moral expression. Of Mademoiselle Salé it has been well said, que tous ses pas étaient des sentiments, that every one of her steps is a feeling. And of Berenice, I more seriously believed que toutes ses dents étaient des idées, that all her teeth were ideas. Des idées. Here was the idiotic thought that destroyed me. Des idées. Ideas. Therefore it was that I coveted them so madly. I felt that their possession could alone ever restore me to peace, in giving me back to reason. And the evening closed in upon me thus, and then the darkness came, and tarried, and went, and the day again dawned, and the mists of a second night were now gathering around, and still I sat motionless in that solitary room, and still I sat buried in meditation, and still the phantasma of the teeth maintained its terrible ascendancy as, with the most vivid and hideous distinctness, it floated about amid the changing lights and shadows of the chamber. At length there broke in upon my dreams a cry as of horror and dismay, and thereunto, after I paused, succeeded the sound of troubled voices, intermingled with many low moanings of sorrow or pain. I arose from my seat, and throwing open one of the doors of the library, saw standing out in the antechamber a servant maiden, all in tears. He told me that Berenice was no more. She had been seized with epilepsy in the early morning, and now, at the closing in of the night, the grave was ready for its tenant, and all the preparations for the burial were completed. I found myself sitting in the library, and again sitting there alone. It seemed that I had newly awakened from a confused and exciting dream. I knew that it was now midnight, and I was well aware that since the setting of the sun, Berenice had been interred, but of that dreary period which intervened, I had no positive, at least no definite comprehension. Yet its memory was replete with horror. Horror more horrible from being vague, and terror more terrible from ambiguity. It was a fearful page in the record of my existence, written all over with dim and hideous and unintelligible recollections. I strived to decipher them, but in vain, while ever and anon, like the spirit of a departed sound, the shrill and piercing shriek of a female voice seemed to be ringing in my ears. I had done a deed. What was it? I asked myself the question aloud, and the whispering echoes of the chamber answered me. What was it? On the table beside me burned a lamp. Near it lay a little box. It was of no remarkable character, and I had seen it frequently before, for it was the property of the family physician. But how came it there, upon my table, and why did I shudder in regarding it? These things were in no manner to be accounted for, and my eyes at length dropped to the open pages of a book, and to a sentence underscored therein. The words were the simple ones of the poet Ibn Zayat. Dicebant mihi sodales si sepulchrum amicae visitarem, curas meas aliquantulum fore levatas. Why then, as I perused them, did the hairs of my head erect themselves on end, and the blood of my body become congealed within my veins? I think it's something to do with visiting the friends of your grave. Oh, thank you, Evelyn. I was about to do a really bad translation myself. My companion said to me if I would visit the grave of my friend, I might somewhat alleviate my worries. Thank you. There came a light tap at the library door, and pale as the tenant of a tomb, a menial entered upon tiptoe. His looks were wild with terror, and he spoke to me in a voice tremulous, husky, and very low. What said he? Some broken sentences I heard. He told of a wild cry disturbing the silence of the night, of the gathering together of the household, of a search in the direction of the sound, and then his tones grew thrillingly distinct as he whispered to me of a violated grave, of a disfigured body enshrouded, yet still breathing, still palpitating, still alive. He pointed to my garments. They were muddy and clotted with gore. I spoke not, and he took me gently by the hand. It was indented with the impress of human nails. He directed my attention to some object against the wall. I looked at it for some minutes. It was a spade. With a shriek, I bounded to the table and grasped the box that lay upon it. But I could not force it open, and in my tremor it slipped from my hands and fell heavily and burst into pieces, and from it, with a rattling sound, there rolled out some instruments of dental surgery, intermingled with 32 small, white, and ivory-looking substances, that were scattered to and fro about the floor. Thank you very much. That was Berenice by Edgar Allan Poe. So we've got a lot of Poe's favorite things here. We've got cousins getting married, even though in the story at least they don't like each other. Well, he doesn't like her. We've got a man who's very complicated because his mind is special. We've got someone being buried alive. Great. Graves being dug up. Excellent. And a bout of madness where something horrible happened. This is basically a perfect story. Although it would have been really good to well, as someone who has teeth in my handbag, I don't feel that I can really hate on this. I keep my wisdom teeth in my handbag so that my young nieces and nephews, if they go into my handbag, find something scary. Because it's also full of pills. Okay, so I remember when I was a kid, I had to read the ending a few times to figure out what had happened. And I kind of got it, but I also kind of didn't, because I thought that can't be what he means. That's too crazy. Like, that is too, you can't write that down in olden days language like Anne of Green Gables. God, books are awesome. So I'm going to do a bonus story because that did not take very long. And this one is another Ray Bradbury from the same book. Terrified me in the same way. And it is called Skeleton. It was past time for him to see the doctor again. Mr. Harris turned palely in at the stairwell, and on his way up the flight saw Dr. Burley's name gilded over a pointing arrow. Bonus story. I got you. I got you. This goes out to Danny for being so brave. I mean, I'm not going to spill any details or anything, but she did some fairly epic stuff today, so that's great. Would Dr. Burley sigh when he walked in? After all, this will make the 10th trip so far this year. But Burley shouldn't complain. He was paid for the examinations. The nurse looked Mr. Harris over and smiled, a bit amusedly, as she tiptoed to the glazed glass door, opened it, and put her head in. Harris thought he heard her say, "Guess who's here, Doctor?" And didn't the doctor's voice reply faintly, "Oh my God, again?" Harris swallowed uneasily. I mean, that's what happens when you go to the doctor, though, right? I wasn't lying yesterday. I did run out of Diet Coke. This is Pepsi Max. When Harris walked in, Dr. Burley snorted. "Aches in your bones again? Ah!" He scowled and adjusted his glasses. "My dear Harris, you've been curried with the finest tooth combs and bacteria brushes known to science. You're just nervous. Let's see your fingers. Too many cigarettes. Let's smell your breath. Too much protein. Let's see your eyes. Not enough sleep. My response? Go to bed, stop the protein, no smoking. $10, please." Harris stood, sulking. The doctor glanced up from his papers. "Are you still here? You're a hypochondriac. And that's $11 now." "But why should my bones ache?" asked Harris. Dr. Burnley spoke as to a child. "Have you ever had a sore muscle and kept rubbing it, irritating it, fussing with it? It gets worse the more you bother it. Then you leave it alone and the pain vanishes. You realize you caused most of the soreness yourself. Well, son, that's what's with you. Leave yourself alone. Take a dose of salts. Get out of here and take that trip to Phoenix you've stewed about for months. Do you good to travel. And this story has themes of doctors ignoring your terrible conditions, except this is a man. I know, right? It's horror, but it's also science fiction. Sorry, bring personal feuds in here. 5 minutes later, Mr. Harris rifled through a classified phone directory at the corner druggist. A fine lot of sympathy one got from blind fools like Burley. He passed his finger down a list of bone specialists, found one named M. Munigant. Munigant lacked an MD or any other academic lettering behind his name, but his office was conveniently near. 3 blocks down, 1 block over. That is how we choose doctors. M. Munigant, like his office, was small and dark. Like his office, he smelled of iodine, and other odd things. He was a good listener, though, and listened for the eager, shiny moves of his eyes. And when he talked to Harris, his accent was such that he softly whistled each word, undoubtedly because of imperfect dentures. Harris told all. M. Munigant nodded. This is not supposed to be Monsieur Munigant, by the way. M. Munigant nodded. He had seen cases like this before. The bones of the body. Man was not aware of his bones. Ah, yes, the bones, the skeleton. Most difficult. Something concerning an imbalance, an unsympathetic coordination between soul, flesh, and skeleton. Very complicated, softly whistled M. Munigant. Harris listened, fascinated. Now here was a doctor who understood his illness. Psychological, said M. Munigant. He moved swiftly, delicately, to a dingy wall and slashed down 6 x-rays to haunt the room with their look of things found floating in an ancient tide. Here, the skeleton surprised. Here, luminous portraits of the long, the short, the large, the small bones. Mr. Harris must be aware of his position, his problem. M. Munigant's hand tapped, rattled, whispered, scratched at faint nebulae of flesh in which hung ghosts of cranium, spinal cord, pelvis, lime, calcium, marrow, here, this, that, these, those, and others. Look! Harris shuddered. The x-rays in the paintings blew in a green and phosphorescent wind from a land peopled by the monsters of Dali and Fuseli. M. Munigant whistled quietly. Did Mr. Harris wish his bones treated? That depends, said Harris. Well, M. Munigant could not help Harris unless Harris was in the proper mood. Psychologically, one had to need help, or the doctor was useless. But, shrugging, M. Munigant would try. Harris lay on a table with his mouth open. The lights were switched off, shades drawn. M. Munigant approached his patient. Something touched Harris's tongue. He felt his jawbones forced out. They creaked and made faint cracking noises. One of those skeleton charts on the dim wall seemed to quiver and jump. A violent shudder seized Mr. Harris. Involuntarily, his mouth snapped shut. M. Munigant shouted. His nose had almost been bitten off. No use, no use. Now was not the time. M. Munigant whispered the shades up, dreadfully disappointed. When Mr. Harris felt he could cooperate psychologically, when Mr. Harris really needed help and trusted M. Munigant to help him, then maybe something could be done. M. Munigant held out his little hand. In the meantime, the fee was only $2. Mr. Harris must begin to think. Here was a sketch for Mr. Harris to take home and study. It would acquaint him with his body. He must be tremblingly aware of himself. He must be on guard. Skeletons were strange, unwieldy things. M. Munigant's eyes glittered. Good day to Mr. Harris. Oh, and would he care for a breadstick? M. Munigant proffered a jar of long, hard, salty breadsticks to Harris, taking one himself, saying that chewing breadsticks kept him in practice. Good day to Mr. Harris. Mr. Harris went home. I'd like two of you, maybe 3. Uh, Probably see that this has a few parallels to a game we've been playing lately. The next day, Sunday, Mr. Harris discovered innumerable fresh aches and pains in his body. He spent the morning, his eyes fixed, staring with new interest at the small, anatomically perfect painting of a skeleton M. Munigan had given him. His wife, Clarice, startled him at dinner when she cracked her exquisitely thin knuckles, one by one, until he clapped his hands to his ears and cried, "Stop!" The rest of the afternoon he quarantined himself in his room. Clarice played bridge in the parlour, laughing and chattering with 3 other ladies, while Harris, hidden away, fingered and weighed the limbs of his body with growing curiosity. After an hour he suddenly rose and called Clarice. She had a way of dancing into any room, her body doing all sorts of soft, agreeable things to keep her feet from ever quite touching the nap of a rug. Isn't that beautiful? She excused herself from her friends and came to see him now, brightly. She found him reseated in a far corner, and she saw that he was staring at the anatomical sketch. "Are you still brooding, sweet?" she asked. "Please don't." And she sat upon his knee. Her beauty could not distract him now in his absorption. He juggled her lightness, he touched her kneecap suspiciously. It seemed to move under her pale, glowing skin. "Is it supposed to do that?" he asked, sucking in his breath. "Is what supposed to do what?" She laughed. "Do you mean my kneecap? Is it supposed to run around on top of your knee that way?" She experimented. "So it does," she marveled. "I'm glad yours slithers too," he sighed. "I was beginning to worry." "About what?" He patted his ribs. "My ribs don't go all the way down. They stop here. And I found some confounded ones that dangle in mid-air." Beneath the curve of her small breast, Clarice clasped her hands. "Of course, silly. Everybody's ribs stop at a given point, and those funny short ones are floating ribs. I hope they don't float around too much." The joke was most uneasy. Now, above all, he wished to be alone. Further discoveries, newer and stranger archaeological diggings lay within reach of his trembling hands, and he did not want to be laughed at. "Thanks for coming in, dear," he said. "Any time." She rubbed her small nose softly against his. "Wait, here now." He put his finger to touch his nose and hers. "Did you realize? The nose bone grows down only this far. From there on, a lot of gristly tissue fills out the rest." She wrinkled hers. "Of course, darling." And she danced from the room. Now, sitting alone, he felt the perspiration rise from the pools and hollows of his face to flow in a thin tide down his cheeks. He licked his lips and shut his eyes. Now. Next on the agenda, what? The spinal cord. Yes. Slowly he examined it, in the same way he operated the many push buttons in his office, thrusting them to summon secretaries and messengers. But now, in these pushings of his spinal column, fears and terrors answered, rushed from a million doors in his mind to confront and shake him. His spine felt horribly unfamiliar, like the brittle shards of a fish freshly eaten, its bones left strewn on a cold china platter. He seized the little rounded nobbins. Lord! His teeth began to chatter. God Almighty, he thought. Why haven't I realized it all these years? All these years I've gone around with a skeleton inside me. How is it we take ourselves for granted? How is it we never question our bodies and our being? A skeleton. One of those jointed, snowy, hard things. One of those foul, dry, brittle, gouge-eyed, skull-faked, shake-fingered, rattling things that sway from neck chains in abandoned webbed closets. Like one of those things found on the desert, all long and scattered like dice. He stood upright because he could not bear to remain seated. Inside me now, he grasped his stomach, his head. Inside my head is a skull. one of those curved carapaces which holds my brain like an electrical jelly, one of those cracked shells with the holes in front, like two holes shot through it by a double-barreled shotgun, with its grottos and caverns of bone, its revetments and placements for my flesh, my smelling, my seeing, my hearing, my thinking. A skull encompassing my brain, allowing it exit through the brittle windows to see the outside world. He wanted to dash into the bridge party, upset it like a fox in a chicken yard, the cards fluttering all around like chicken feathers burst upward in clouds. He stopped himself, only with a violent, trembling effort. Now, man, control yourself. This is a revelation, but take it for what it's worth. Understand it. Savor it. But a skeleton, screamed his subconscious. I won't stand for it. It's vulgar. It's terrible. It's frightening. Skeletons are horrors. They clink and tinkle and rattle in old castles hung from oaken beams, making long, indolently rustling pendulums on the wind. Darling, will you come meet the ladies? His wife's clear, sweet voice called from far away. Mr. Harris stood. His skeleton held him up. This thing inside, this invader, this horror, was supporting his arms, legs, and head. It was like feeling someone just behind you who shouldn't be there. With every step, he realized how dependent he was on this other thing. Darling, I'll be with you in a moment, he called weakly. To himself, he said, come on, brace up. You've got to go back to work tomorrow. Friday, you must make that trip to Phoenix. It's a long drive, hundreds of miles. Must be in shape for that trip or you won't get Mr. Crowden to invest in your ceramics business. Chin up now. Ceramics. A moment later, he stood among the ladies, being introduced to Mrs. Withers, Mrs. Abelmat, and Miss Kirthy, all of whom had skeletons inside them, but took it very calmly, because nature had carefully clothed the bare nudity of clavicle, tibia, and femur with breasts, thighs, calves, with coiffure and eyebrow satanic, with bee-stung lips, and Lord, shouted Mr. Harris inwardly, when they talk or eat, part of their skeleton shows. Their teeth. I never thought of that. Excuse me, he gasped, and ran from the room only in time to drop his lunch among the petunias over the garden balustrade. Tonight's theme is teeth. That night, seated on the bed as his wife undressed, he pared his toenails and fingernails scrupulously. These parts, too, were where his skeleton was shoving, indignantly growing out. He must have muttered part of this theory, because next thing he knew, his wife, in negligee, was on the bed, her arms around his neck, yawning, Oh, my darling, fingernails are not bone. They're only hardened epidermis. He threw the scissors down. Are you certain? I hope so. I'd feel better. He looked at the curve of her body, marveling. I hope all people are made the same way. You aren't the darndest hypochondriac. She held him at arm's length. Come on, what's wrong? Tell Mama. Something inside me, he said. Something I ate. The next morning and all afternoon at his downtown office, Mr. Harris sorted out the sizes, shapes, and construction of various bones in his body with displeasure. At 10 a.m., he asked to feel Mr. Smith's elbow one moment. Mr. Smith obliged, but scowled suspiciously. And after lunch, Mr. Harris asked to touch Miss Laurel's shoulder blade, and she immediately pushed herself back against him, purring like a kitten and shutting her eyes. Miss Laurel, he snapped. Stop that. Well, you can't ask to touch a lady's shoulder blade, especially not one who works for you. I mean, we haven't really stopped doing that. Alone, he pondered his neuroses. The war was just over. The pressure of his work, the uncertainty of the future probably had much to do with his mental outlook. He wanted to leave the office, get into business for himself. He had more than a little talent for ceramics and sculpture. As soon as possible, he'd head for Arizona, Borrow that money from Mr. Crowden, build a kiln, and set up shop. It was a worry. What a case he was. But luckily he had contacted M. Munigant, who seemed eager to understand and help him. He would fight it out with himself, and not go back to either Munigant or Dr. Burley unless he was forced to. The alien feeling would pass. He sat, staring into space. The alien feeling did not pass. It grew. On Tuesday and Wednesday, it bothered him terrifically that his epidermis, hair, and other appendages were of a high disorder, whilst his integumented skeleton of himself was a slick, clean structure of efficient organisation. Sometimes, in certain lights, with his lips drawn morosely down, weighted with melancholy, he imagined he saw his skull grinning at him behind the flesh. "Let go," he cried. "Let go of me, my lungs, stop!" He gasped convulsively as if his ribs were crushing the breath from him. "My brain, stop squeezing it!" And terrifying headaches burnt his brain to a blind cinder. "My insides, let them be, for God's sake, stay away from my heart." His heart cringed from the fanning motion of ribs like pale spiders crouched and fiddling with their prey. Drenched with sweat, he lay upon the bed one night while Clarice was out attending a Red Cross meeting. He tried to gather his wits, but only grew more aware of the conflict between his dirty exterior and this beautiful, cool, clean, calciumed thing inside. His complexion, wasn't it oily and lined with worry? Observe the flawless, snow-white perfection of the skull. His nose, wasn't it too large? Then observe the tiny bones of the skull's nose before that monstrous nasal cartilage begins forming the lopsided proboscis. His body, wasn't it plump? Well, consider the skeleton. Slender, svelte, economical of line and contour, exquisitely carved oriental ivory, perfect, thin as a white praying mantis. His eyes, weren't they protuberant, ordinary, numb-looking? Be so kind as to note the eye sockets of the skull, so deep and rounded, sombre, quiet pools, all-knowing, eternal. Gaze deep, and you never touch the bottom of their dark understanding. All irony, all life, all everything is there in the cupped darkness. Compare, compare, compare. He raged for hours. And the skeleton, ever the frail and solemn philosopher, hung quietly inside, saying not a word, suspended like a delicate insect within a chrysalis, waiting and waiting. Harris sat slowly up. "Wait a minute. Hold on," he exclaimed. "You're helpless too. I've got you too. I can make you do anything I want. You can't prevent it. I say move your carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges, and up they go as I wave to someone." He laughed. "I order the fibula and femur to locomote, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. We walk around the block. There." Harris grinned. "It's a 50-50 fight, even Steven. And we'll fight it out, we two. After all, I'm the part that thinks. Yes. By God, yes. Even if I didn't have you, I could still think." Instantly, a tiger's jaw snapped shut, chewing his brain in half. Harris screamed. The bones of his skull grabbed hold and gave him nightmares. Then slowly, while he shrieked, nuzzled, and ate the nightmares one by one until the last one was gone and the light went out. At the end of the week, he postponed the Phoenix trip because of his health. Weighing himself on a penny scale, he saw the slow, gliding red arrow point to 165. He groaned. "Why, I've weighed 175 for years. I can't have lost 10 pounds. He examined his cheeks in the fly-dotted mirror. Cold, primitive fear rushed over him in odd little shivers. You, I know what you're about, you." He shook his fist at his bony face, particularly addressing his remarks to his superior maxillary, his inferior maxillary, to his cranium, and to his cervical vertebrae. You damn thing, you. Think you can starve me, make me lose weight, huh? Peel the flesh off, leave nothing but skin on bone, trying to ditch me so you can be supreme, huh? No, no. He fled into a cafeteria. Turkey, dressing, creamed potatoes, 4 vegetables, 3 desserts. He could eat none of it. He was sick to his stomach. He forced himself. His teeth began to ache. Bad teeth, is it? He thought angrily. I'll eat in spite of every tooth clanging and banging and rattling so they fall on my gravy. His head blazed. His breath jerked in and out of a constricted chest. His teeth raged with pain, but he knew one small victory. He was about to drink milk when he stopped and poured it into a vase of nasturtiums. No calcium for you, my boy, no calcium for you. Never again shall I eat foods with calcium or other bone-fortifying minerals. I'll eat for one of us, not both, my lad. 150 pounds, he said the following week to his wife. Do you see how I've changed? For the better, said Clarice. You were always a little plump for your height, darling. She stroked his chin. I like your face. It's so much nicer. The lines of it are so firm and strong now. They're not my lines, they're his, damn him. You mean to say you like him better than you like me? Him? Who's him? In the parlour mirror, beyond Clarice, his skull smiled back at him behind his fleshly grimace of hatred and despair. Fuming, he popped malt tablets into his mouth. This was one way of gaining weight when you couldn't keep other foods down. Clarice noticed the malt pellets. But darling, really, you don't have to regain the weight for me, she said. Oh, shut up, he felt like saying. She made him lie with his head in her lap. Darling, she said, I've watched you lately. You're so badly off. You don't say anything, but you look hunted. You toss in bed all night. Maybe you should go to a psychiatrist. But I think I can tell you everything he would say. I've put it all together from hints you've let escape you. I can tell you that you and your skeleton are one and the same. One nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. United you stand, divided you fall. If you two fellows can't get along like an old married couple in the future, go back and see Dr. Burley. But first, relax. You're in a vicious circle. The more you worry, the more your bones stick out, the more you worry. After all, who picked this fight? You or that anonymous entity you claim is lurking around behind your alimentary canal? He closed his eyes. I did. I guess I did. Go on, Clarice, keep talking. You rest now, she said softly. Rest and forget. Mr. Harris felt buoyed up for half a day. Then he began to sag. It was all very well to blame his imagination, but this particular skeleton, by God, was fighting back. Harris set out for M. Munigant's office late in the day. Walking for half an hour until he found the address, he caught sight of the name M. Munigant initialed in ancient flaking gold on a glass plate outside the building. Then his bones seemed to explode from their moorings, blasted and erupted with pain. Blinded, he staggered away. When he opened his eyes again, he had rounded a corner. M. Munigant's office was out of sight. The pain ceased. M. Munigant was the man to help him. If the sight of his name could cause so titanic a reaction, of course M. Munigant must be just the man. But not today. Each time he tried to return to that office, the terrible pains took hold. Perspiring, he had to give up and swayed into a cocktail bar. Moving across the dim lounge, he wondered briefly if a lot of the blame couldn't be put on M. Munigant's shoulders. After all, it was Munigant who'd first drawn specific attention to his skeleton and let the psychological impact of it slam home. Could M. Munigant be using him for some nefarious purpose? For what purpose? Silly to suspect him. Just a little doctor, trying to be helpful. Munigan and his jar of breadsticks. Ridiculous. And Munigan was okay. Okay. There was a sight within the cocktail lounge to give him hope. A large fat man, round as a butterball, stood drinking consecutive beers at the bar. Now there was a successful man. Harris repressed a desire to go up, clap the fat man's shoulder, and inquire as to how he'd gone about impounding his bones. Yes, the fat man's skeleton was luxuriously closeted. There were pillows of fat here, resilient bulges of it there, with several round chandeliers of fat under his chin. The poor skeleton was lost. It could never fight clear of that blubber. He might have tried once, but not now. Overwhelmed. Not a bony echo of the fat man's supporter remained. I didn't think this really counted as fat shaming because the narrator is extremely impressed with this man. Not without envy, Harris approached the fat man as one might cut across the bow of an ocean liner. Harris ordered a drink, drank it, and then dared to address the fat man. Glance? You talking to me? Asked the fat man. Or is there a special diet? Wondered Harris. I beg your pardon, but as you can see, I'm down. Can't seem to put on any weight. I'd like a stomach like that one of yours. Did you grow up because you were afraid of something? You, announced the fat man, are drunk. But I like drunkards. He ordered more drinks. Listen close. I'll tell you later. I'll tell you. Layer by layer, said the fat man. 20 years, man and boy, I built this. He held his vast stomach like a globe of the world, teaching his audience its gastronomical geography. There was no overnight circus. The tent was not raised before dawn on the wonders in store within. I have cultivated my inner organs as if they were thoroughbred dogs, cats, and other animals. My stomach is a fat pink Persian Tom slumbering, rousing at intervals to purr, meow, growl, and cry for chocolate titbits. I feed it well. It almost sit up for me. And, my dear fellow, my intestines are the rarest, purebred Indian anacondas you ever viewed, in the sleekest, coiled, fine and ruddy health. Keep 'em in prime, I do, all my pets. For fear of something? Perhaps. This called for another drink for everyone. Gain weight. The fat man savoured the words on his tongue. Here's what you do. Get yourself a quarrelling bird of a wife, a baker's dozen of relatives who can flush a covey of troubles out from behind the veriest molehill. Add to these a sprinkling of business associates whose prime motivation is snatching your last lonely quid, and you are well on your way to getting fat. How so? In no time you'll begin subconsciously building fat betwixt you and them. A buffer epidermal state, a cellular wall. You'll soon find that eating is the only fun on earth. But one needs to be bothered by outside sources. Too many people in this world haven't enough to worry about. Then they begin picking on themselves, and they lose weight. Meet all of the vile, terrible people you can possibly meet, and pretty soon you'll be adding the good old fat. And with that advice, the fat man launched himself out into the dark tide of the night, swaying mightily and wheezing. That's exactly what Dr. Burley told me. Slightly changed, said Harris thoughtfully. Perhaps that trip to Phoenix, now at this time. Like, again, kind of was going to include a thing for vivid descriptions of fat, but at the same time, the skeleton also has a very vivid description that's the whole point of the story. So, kind of like the idea of my skeleton being suppressed. Right. The trip from Los Angeles to Phoenix was a sweltering one. Crossing, as it did, I can't pronounce that word, desert, on a broiling yellow day. It's Mojave, and probably any Americans will be like, duh, it's pronounced such and such. Traffic was thin and inconsistent, and for long stretches there would not be a car on the road for miles ahead or behind. Harris twitched his fingers on the steering wheel. Whether or not Crowden and Phoenix lent him the money he needed to start his business, it was still a good thing to get away, to put distance behind. The car moved in the hot sluice of desert wind. The one Mr. H sat inside the other Mr. H. Perhaps both perspired. Perhaps both were miserable. Oh, okay, Mojave Desert. Anyway, that's where our hero is, and our other heroes. On a curve, the inside Mr. H suddenly constricted the outer flesh, causing him to jerk forward onto the hot steering wheel. The car plunged off the road into boiling sand and turned half over. Night came. A wind rose. The road was lonely and silent. The few cars that passed went swiftly on their way, their view obstructed. Mr. Harris lay unconscious. Until very late, he heard a wind rising out of the desert, felt the sting of little sand needles on his cheeks, and opened his eyes. Morning found him gritty-eyed and wandering in thoughtless, senseless circles, having, in his delirium, got away from the road. At noon, he sprawled in the poor shade of a bush. The sun struck him with a keen sword edge, cutting through to his bones. A vulture circled. Harris's parched lips cracked open. "So that's it," he whispered, red-eyed, bristle-cheeked. "One way or another, you'll walk me, starve me, thirst me, kill me." He swallowed dry burrs of dust. "Sun cook off my flesh so you can peek out. Vultures lunch off me, and there you'll lie, grinning with victory, like a bleached xylophone strewn and played by vultures with an ear for odd music. You'd like that. Freedom." He walked on through a landscape that shivered and bubbled in the direct pour of sunlight, stumbling, falling flat, trying to feed himself little mouths of fire. The air was blue alcohol flame, and vultures roasted and steamed and glittered as they flew in glides and circles. Phoenix. The road. Car. Water. Safety. "Hey!" Someone called from far off in the blue alcohol flame. Mr. Harris propped himself up. "Hey!" The call was repeated, a crunching of footsteps. Quick! With a cry of unbelievable relief, Harris rose, only to collapse again into the arms of someone in a uniform with a badge. The car tediously hauled, repaired, Phoenix reached. Harris found himself in such an unholy state of mind that the business transaction was a dumb pantomime. Even when he got the loan and held the money in his hand, it meant nothing. This thing within him, like a hard white sword in a scabbard, tainted his business, his eating, coloured his love for Clarice, made it unsafe to trust an automobile. All in all, this thing had to be put in its place. The desert incident had brushed too close. Too near the bone, one might say, with an ironic twist of one's mouth. Harris heard himself thanking Mr. Crowden dimly for the money. Then he turned his car and motored back across the long miles, this time cutting across to San Diego, so he would miss that desert stretch between El Centro and Beaumont. He drove north along the coast. He didn't trust that desert. But careful! Salt waves boomed, hissing on the beach outside Laguna. Sand, fish, and crustacea would cleanse his bones as swiftly as vultures. Slow down on the curves over the surf. Damn, he was sick. Where to turn? Clarice? Burley? Munigant? Bone specialist. Munigant. Well? Darling! Clarice kissed him. He winced at the solidness of the teeth and jaw behind the passionate exchange. "Darling," he said, slowly, wiping his lips with his wrist, trembling. "You look thinner. Oh, darling, the business deal. It went through, I guess. Yes, it did. She kissed him again. They ate a slow, falsely cheerful dinner, with Clarice laughing and encouraging him. He studied the phone. Several times he picked it up indecisively, then laid it down. His wife walked in, putting on her coat and hat. Well, sorry, but I have to leave. She pinched him on the cheek. Come on now, cheer up. I'll be back from Red Cross in 3 hours. You lie around and snooze. I simply have to go. When Clarice was gone, Harris dialed the phone, nervously. Immunigant? The explosions and the sickness in his body after he set the phone down were unbelievable. His bones were racked with every kind of pain, cold and hot, he had ever thought of or experienced in wildest nightmare. He swallowed all of the aspirin he could find in an effort to stave off the assault, but when the doorbell finally rang an hour later, he could not move. He lay weak and exhausted, panting, tears streaming down his cheeks. Come in, for God's sake. Immunigant came in. Thank God the door was unlocked. Oh, but Mr. Harris looked terrible. Immunigant stood in the centre of the living room, small and dark. Harris nodded. The pains rushed through him, hitting him with large iron hammers and hooks. Immunigant's eyes glittered as he saw Harris's protuberant bones. Ah, he saw that Mr. Harris was now psychologically prepared for aid. Was it not so? Harris nodded again, feebly, sobbing. Immunigant still whistled when he talked. Something about his tongue and the whistling. No matter. Through his shimmering eyes, Harris seemed to see Immunigant shrink, get smaller. Imagination, of course. Harris sobbed out his story of the Phoenix trip. Immunigant sympathized. This skeleton was a traitor. They would fix him for once and for all. Mr. Munigant, sighed Harris faintly, I never noticed before. Your tongue. Round. Tube-like. Hollow. My eyes. Delirious. What do I do? Immunigant whistled softly, appreciatively, coming closer. If Mr. Harris would relax in his chair and open his mouth. The lights were switched off. Immunigant peered into Harris's dropped jaw. Wider, please. It had been so hard that first visit to help Harris, with both body and bone in revolt. Now he had cooperation from the flesh of the man, anyway, even if the skeleton protested. In the darkness, Immunigant's voice got small, tiny. The whistling became high and shrill. Now. Relax, Mr. Harris. Now! Harris felt his jaw pressed violently in all directions, his tongue depressed as with a spoon, his throat clogged. He gasped for breath. Whistle. He couldn't breathe. Something squirmed, corkscrewed his cheeks out, bursting his jaws. Like a hot water douche, something squirted into his sinuses. His ears clanged. Ah! Shrieked Harris, gagging. His head, its carapaces riven, shattered, hung loose. Agony shot fire through his lungs. Harris could breathe again, momentarily. His watery eyes sprang wide. He shouted. His ribs, like sticks picked up and bundled, were loosened in him. Pain! He fell to the floor, wheezing out his hot breath. Lights flickered in his senseless eyeballs. He felt his limbs swiftly cast loose and free. Through streaming eyes, he saw the parlor. The room was empty. Immunigant, in God's name, where are you, Immunigant? Come help me. Immunigant was gone. Help! Then he heard it. Deep down in the subterranean fissures of his body, the minute, unbelievable noises, little smackings and twistings and little dry chippings and grindings and nuzzling sounds. Like a tiny, hungry mouse down in the red-blooded dimness, gnawing ever so earnestly and expertly at what might have been, but was not, a submerged timber. Hey, Jessie. Clarice, walking along the sidewalk, held her head high and marched straight toward her house on St. James Place. She was thinking of the Red Cross as she turned the corner and almost ran into this little dark man who smelled of iodine. Clarice would have ignored him if it were not for the fact that as she passed, he took something long, white, and oddly familiar from his coat and proceeded to chew on it as on a peppermint stick. Its end devoured, his extraordinary tongue darted within the white confection, sucking out the filling, making contented noises. He was still crunching his goodie as she proceeded up the sidewalk to her house, turned the doorknob, and walked in. "Darling," she called, smiling around. "Darling, where are you?" She shut the door, walked down the hall and into the living room. "Darling?" She stared at the floor for 20 seconds, trying to understand. She screamed. Outside in the sycamore darkness, the little man pierced a long white stick with intermittent holes. Then, softly, sighing, his lips puckered, played a little sad tune upon the improvised instrument to accompany the shrill and awful singing of Clarice's voice as she stood in the living room. Many times as a little girl, Clarice had run on the beach sands, stepped on a jellyfish and screamed. It was not so bad finding an intact, gelatin-skinned jellyfish in one's living room. One could step back from it. It was when the jellyfish called you by name. The end. And so that is Skeleton by Ray Bradbury. It's the one that I was thinking about doing a switcheroo on John with when he gave me the October game to read. Yeah, so this, yeah. Now imagine that you're like 6. Someday I hope this book gives terrible nightmares to my children. But yeah, it also has Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, which I've already read on here, just not from this book. It's got August Heat, which is very good and very short. And another Ray Bradbury. Faulkner's A Rose for Emily, which is a fantastic story. Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you don't invite M. Munigant to your home, you are automatically drafted into the Skeleton War. It's true. So yeah, this is a hugely formative influence on me, I think. I was already super into horror by the time I was by the time I could actually read this book. But it introduced me to some amazing authors. And the one that's all in that weird Scots dialect, which I might do just for fun. Yeah, it really does. The most horrible story in this book is called Raspberry Jam. And that's the one with the animal cruelty in it, which I won't talk about here because I don't want to talk about it. But it just gives me the shivers every time I think about it. And it does to my dad as well. And he first read it, I think, when he was like, I don't know, 7 or 8. So yeah, that really stuck for me. Yes, I think I have read Trainspotting, but like ages and ages ago. I can read the weird dialect. I just can't. Well, okay, I don't know that I can't read it out loud. In character as Sean Connery, but might not be that spooky. Although it would be entertaining. and that's the one by John Keir Cross, who compiled the stories rather. So one of his own stories is in here. Yeah, no, I'm not going to do that today because I've already been talking for an hour and a half. But yes, yeah, I saw the movie. It was good. Sorry, I can hear these hungry cats outside. Thank you guys for watching. I'm really glad that we got to talk about teeth and premature burial and skeletons and underage cousin marriage. Oh, Eddie. So if you have any ideas for what I should read next, you can tell me. I may or may not take any suggestions because I kind of want to introduce some of my favorites. Thank you for showing up, John, and Jesse, and Danny, and Evelyn, and, well, I think that's it. A few people, a couple of people maybe who have not actually been posting in chat. Oh, and Diane Honey in there. Hi, Di. Hi, honey. I hope you weren't listening. I don't want you to get scared. So yeah, thank you all so much, and I'll see you tomorrow. I haven't decided what to do yet, but it'll be something amazing, probably. Thank you, XQRQR. See you guys tomorrow. End stream.